So thank you, Linda and Michela and friends at INTI for organizing this. Thank you, Government of Almere, for supporting us and for coming and showing your support. Today what I'm going to talk about is, there you have it, the shift from urban construction to social innovation in Shenzhen. And I'm basically going to do math. I'm going to tell some stories and do some math. And it's kind of a la Clifford Geertz, which is a deep unpacking of a story. Okay, so here's the story. I was actually at the Futian River, which is one of the rivers that runs through the Central Park in Shenzhen. It was, up until a few years ago, a combined sewage and rainwater river. And so basically it was a gutter. And then as part of the upgrading of the urban plan, they separated sewage and rainwater to make two flows. So you don't actually see the sewage flowing into the ocean because it's running under the rainwater. So one of the things they've been doing with the park is they're holding a sculpture exhibit there. So I have a piece in the exhibition, and so I was down kind of like checking out the area. And there is a man, kind of dressed like a beekeeper, you know, completely covered in plastic with long gloves, a mask. And he's in the marsh area of the river, where it is posted, you are not allowed in the river. And he's down in the river. And the people who are talking with us about where we're putting our sculptures are the head of the parks in Futian district and the head of security for this particular park. And so at some point, the head of security looks at us, excuses himself, and goes down to talk with the man in the river about what is he doing. And there's the head of security takes a picture, and they talk. And then the person goes back into the river and keeps doing whatever it was he was doing. And the head of security comes back to me and says, "That's a good man. He's actually weeding out all of these vines that would choke the indigenous life in the river." And so, you know, he's a good man. And so I'm looking, it's still posted, "Do not go into the river." The head of security has left. And the reason he has left the man in the river is because he's a good person and he's doing something good. And so I'm going to unpack this story. Like, what does this tell us about how Shenzhen works? Okay. The first thing that you have to understand this story is yeji. And yeji is a concept in Chinese government or business, and it means accomplishments. And it's what you would put down in order to get promotions. So let's say that you want to you're an architect and you want to get ahead. Your yeji are the buildings you've done. If you are a politician in Shenzhen, your yeji are going to be what you do in the city. Now, depending on how ambitious you are, you're going to need big yeji or little yeji, or if you just want to kind of hang out in the Shenzhen government forever, then you're going to adopt 多一事不如少一事, this kind of an ideology, which is, why do something when you can do nothing and just kind of float along? All right? So in Shenzhen, there are traditionally two sources of yeji. One would be the one country, two systems, which hooks us back into the politics of Hong Kong and Shenzhen and opening China to different forms of acceptable governance within its administration and economic liberalization. And so the picture to y'all's left is the Shenzhen-Hong Kong border in 1981, and you can see that the soldiers are still wearing People's Liberation uniforms. And to the right, that's 1987 in Shekou, and it was the first land auction which opened up a whole new ways of making money through real estate in Shenzhen. I've put them in this order because one of the things that you've probably heard throughout the morning's presentations is to understand Shenzhen, you have to think of it as a manifestation of political decisions. So that if we're talking about the Shenzhen economy, we are talking about the economic effects of political decisions. If we're talking about buildings or neighborhoods, we are talking about the effects of not making political decisions. This is how they are read. And in fact, it is a very explicit part of the Shenzhen ideology that what the city looks like is in fact a result of political decisions. And so one of the problems that urban villages have, for example, is because nobody bothered to do anything there. They become this like eyesore and possibly anti-Yeji for politicians. And so what you have is your basic, the first math problem that we all need to know is political plus economic reforms equals the Shenzhen skyline. This is, in a nutshell, the ideology of Yeji. Now, what this means is that how do you get different kinds of ideas into this system, alternative values, when the only way for leaders to get ahead is through their Yeji, and their Yeji are actually determined by whoever's in charge of their next level of government, right? So this is one of the key problems that people who are trying to make change face in Shenzhen, that Yeji is determined by the upper level in government. And you kind of have to find new ways of doing things or not do anything and hope you get a promotion just because you've been there. So that there is a sense in which Yeji is not antagonistic to, but is not analogous with Gongyi, which is the public good. And so Gongyi is now a word that's being bandied about Shenzhen, and it basically means how do you get public good out of projects that by and large are interpreted as stepping stones for political advancement. So the story of Gongyi is going to be a story of inhabitation. And so this picture here is a public arts project at Dalang, where doing parking lot graffiti. And take a note of the red vests, because they show up in a lot of places. Gongyi is also a story of alternative values. So this picture from the Nanshan Daily, these are from the Shenzhen Cat Group. Shenzhen Cat is one of the largest organized registered groups in Shenzhen, and they rescue cats. This is an anti-don't eat bear spleen or protest. They do a lot of protests in Shenzhen about don't eat dogs, don't eat cats. When Gangxia was being razed and the people had left, one of the things they did was to prevent people from returning to buildings that had already been cleared out. They sealed them off with concrete, and there were animals that were locked inside the buildings, and so Shenzhen Cat organized people to go door to door breaking windows and rescuing the animals that were locked in the buildings and would have been raised with them. Now, one of the reasons, what also complicates the issue of public good in the Gongyi, is the idea that Shenzhen's government, as one of its reforms, is now purchasing public good products. They're basically outsourcing their public goods. So for example, the side to your left, the district level Futian district, purchased an international photography and film festival that was staged in Shuiwei village. And so this outdoor gallery was put up in the middle of the village for 2 weeks. To the right at the street level, again, Dalang, which is where there is, that's a migrant worker male chorus, and they're working with a public arts musician from England. So that these projects, which are state approved of because the state is doing it, they've actually produced by purchasing or outsourcing these services. And in Shuko, where I'm a bit more familiar, it's to the point where the Shuko Street has actually commissioned an agency to find them agencies to identify groups that are doing the kind of public programs they would like to purchase. So that in a sense, we have this sense of yeji, which is tied to doing these projects, but they're being outsourced. So this leads to the idea of social innovation. So we've got inhabitation, alternative values, spiced with government money, and we get social innovation. And so at the large scale, something that everyone in this room is probably familiar with would be the Shenzhen Biennale, which is partially funded by the government, but is also highly funded by other companies and outside sources. And they work with the Shenzhen Center for Design. Huang Laoshi can correct me if I'm wrong, but is not fully within the government apparatus. And so that we have this high level outsourcing of important functions within the city to grassroots, which are non-registered groups that organize via social media. So ESC, which is a group of collectivized graffiti people who specialize in doing graffiti to improve neighborhoods, basically graffiti beautification. And they set up their projects and their meeting via WeChat. And so they send out a call. They say, we're going to be at this building at this time. They send out copies of the pictures. And then when you get there, they kind of divide you up into labor and you paint the houses or whatever it is they're painting. But one of the things that we see that's very important here, and I'm going to check my time, okay, is that social innovation and Yeji, what they share is an ideology of care for the city. And that if we go back to the story that started this talk, the idea that this was a good person who was out there doing something for the city actually was more important than the posted notice not to go into the river. And there is a sense in which maybe, yes, taxes should be used to clean up the river. Yes. But when that is not happening, and given the fact that so many public good services are being outsourced, if someone is out there voluntarily doing something that is not in conflict with what is seen to be going on around, there's a good chance that it will either be tacitly left alone or explicitly adopted into whatever Shenzhen is up to at the moment. And so at the large kind of scale, we have identity projects, which are sometimes known in Mandarin as 面子工程 or face projects. That is a critical take on them. But what these projects are, how they are justified, and the reason I'm going with identity projects here, they are justified through the idea that they are stimulating growth in the city. They are justified by the idea that different parts of the city needs different kinds of investment. And so even if they are yeji for a government official to get pushed up a level, they need to be phrased now in the ideology of care for the city. At the other end are the Shenzhen volunteers, the red vest people, who are one of the largest organizations in Shenzhen of people who volunteer throughout the city at every level of government to complete and enhance ongoing projects in the city. So what does this lead to? Social innovation in Shenzhen, if we are looking at it ideologically, it seems that it's a really interesting way of saying there's a space that's been created for what in other parts of the world would be talked about in terms of rights to the city. So it is however, it is a non-oppositional discourse. And this is really important because it still is constrained by the idea of yeji, or what is acceptable within the vision of a certain leader in terms of getting a promotion. However, if you look at the projects that are being funded, if you look at the variety of people who are involved, they are all involved in things like how do you get workers' rights, right? So there's a project of interviewing former residents of Gangxia village. And the explicit project is trying to do is to get documentation of renters' voices into the urban planning record. And so that in another city, a project like that would come under a rights to the city discourse, but in Shenzhen, it is articulated as a care for the city. And this care for the city is a very much important ideology because, as I said at the beginning of the lecture, it actually integrates disparate discourses within the government and within the public. And so that these different groups of people are bridged by an understanding that what Shenzhen needs and the kind of social innovation it needs are care for the city. And I'm done.
Please, Marianne, please stand here. I want to ask you a question or two. Yeah. Sorry. Thank you for your presentation, of course. Interesting. Another level, actually, I might say, we have gone to, in sense of parts of the city. If I'm correct, you mentioned this Yeji and Gongi. If I'm understand it correctly, you came with the conclusion actually that this care for the city is an important element in these enterprises and these projects, spontaneously or not. But you mentioned the phrase when it is not in conflict with official rules, regulations. Isn't that a very narrow and uncertain margin actually to?
I think it's a statement of fact that within the People's Republic, and it's actually more so the further north you get, Shenzhen is a bit more open in this, that one of the reasons I started with the picture of the city, everything that happens in Shenzhen is considered an effect of political decisions. This is a cultural understanding of what you are looking at. So I do not know what all of you see when you look at me standing here. I do not know what kinds of social enabling you see that allows me to stand here. So for example, do you see a certain level of academic accomplishment? Do you see a certain level of interaction with people at INTI? Do you see the fact that Almere has money to bring in imported intellectuals? You know, I don't know what kinds of things that you would see when you see me standing here. But in Shenzhen, one of the things you would see would be, at the very least, approval by the government, tacit or explicit. And that this is one of the things that, you know, that are unspoken ways of looking at the world. And so this idea that if you are a good person, the unspoken idea in Shenzhen at the moment is that care for the city is shared across the spectrum. And so even if there is disagreement, it's going to be disagreement over what constitutes care. And they could be very divergent, but nobody's going to explicitly oppose. But that's very different from saying, but mutually incompatible ideologies and values exist all over the place in Shenzhen. And it's like an art to say, oh, care for the city.
Okay. Well, another question. We've been hearing this morning, I think the representatives of the city have left already, but there's also a part of this cooperation and equality agreement between Almere and Shenzhen is also a cultural aspect. So it was mentioned quite clearly. It's not only spatial planning, it's also a cultural aspect. How do you see, I mean, you mentioned the Biennale already, which is of course a platform where foreigners, so to say, are showing their skills, but how would you reckon these ambitions, so to say, from a city of Almere on a cultural level could contribute to this, if I may say so, very difficult and intriguing balance that you've been explaining? Are there possibilities? Because the examples you showed of people are all inhabitants of Shenzhen who probably know what's going on and dealing on. I mean, and maybe the second question would be, is that at all needed? But so the cultural cooperation between people from abroad.
Couple ways of answering that. Cultural collaboration is yeji. Bringing in foreigners is yeji. For the collaboration to work, it has to be about care for Shenzhen. And care for Shenzhen is going to be very much determined by how the leader in charge of a project understands that. And so your work becomes really convincing the leader who's in charge of a project that your version of care is a version they want to get behind. And so one of the reasons these projects are successful and they proliferate is because there's much more space for changing a leader's mind. And that's the interesting thing about the story I opened with. It's posted, "Do not go into the river." The head of security goes down and is like, "Why are you in the river?" And he's like, "Well, I've got to get rid of the vines because they're choking off the native plants." And he's like, "Okay." Right? Leaders are open to hearing new ways of caring for the city. But you have to convince them that that is what you are doing. Or you have to convince them that your version of what you're bringing is good for their yeji. And so, like, if your yeji will get them a promotion, good. If your yeji will raise their GDP, which is also yeji, good. If you're showing up at a project will make other leaders think that foreigners support their version of Shenzhen, good. I mean, it's all about how do you see what you see. What do you think makes it possible for you to sit in that seat? What conditions have to be met for you to be sitting where you are sitting? I would say, looking at you with kind of Chinese Shenzhen eyes, you need to live in a country where the government spends a lot of money on culture and where your employers are like, okay, take a day off to go talk about another city. That's what I see, in part. Not only, but in part. It's like you're here because you live in a country where the government supports this kind of conversation. And that's part of what I see because having lived in Shenzhen.
Okay. We'll get back to that later. Thank you so far.